So I'm here with Josefine Wikström, and I've spent the last days reading a recent book called Practices of Relations in Task Dance and the Event Score, a critique of performances. So I thought we would talk a little about that book. I mean, I think already in the title, critique of performance, you wonder what is critique here, and you begin by setting up a kind of division between the American tradition of performance studies, which is very cultural, anthropological, and goes back to pragmatism and many traditions, and a kind of critical tradition, which is you call it the German tradition of critical theory, which has been, I mean, not so often applied to the idea of dance and those kinds of traditions. So I wanted to begin by asking me, what is this? We call it the cultural concept of performance. What is that? The cultural concept of performance.
So, I make the distinction in the book between what I call, as you mentioned, a cultural concept of performance and what I aim to at least work towards, a critical concept of performance. And the cultural concept of performance, I guess, is a concept that I came across as I began to... I knew I wanted to write about certain performance practices in a specific time. But when I looked into the literature of these performance practices and dance practices, all the literature based their idea of performance that comes from a tradition that I think is based very much in Anglo-American traditions of what I call cultural theory. Disciplines such as performance studies, cultural studies, but also we can find it in gender studies, in these kind of disciplines that emerged at a certain point, and their understanding of performance in their turn came very much from disciplines like anthropology, sociology, and philosophically from traditions like structuralism. Claude Lévi-Strauss is huge in performance studies, but also pragmatism, like you mentioned. And here especially John Dewey has played a key role. So I sort of I found a field that was not just a field, but that was also very dominant when one comes to speak about performance, that uses terms such as ritual, for example, to speak about performance, or that uses terms like experience or immersion, to name a kind of collapse between subject and object. Like there was a specific tradition of philosophy inside a field of cultural theory that spoke about the performance in a way that I found problematic. And the main problem that I found with this field was that they didn't have an understanding of art in a kind of modern sense, art as a kind of critical notion within the history of modernity, perhaps from 1700 and onwards. Yet the only way in which performance was spoken about in art history, for example, American professor Amelia Jones, for example, who has written all the major surveys on performance and so forth, she used a concept of performance from a field that has no idea about what art in its modern understanding is, or at least they don't want to know about it. So this was this was like the field that I mapped out, and then I wanted to try to begin. Okay, so how can we construct an understanding of performance that actually comes from within the where they are placed, which is within a context of art. And for me, when we speak about art, we always have to speak about art in modernity. So in relation to all the transformations of modernity, like capitalism, commodities, the construction of a new subject, of aesthetics, the sphere of aesthetics, and so on. So if we wanna speak about performance, we need to first place performance in art. That was like my main concern, and then so that was sort of like, and trying to speak about performance within art. That was the main concern thinking about like how a critical concept of performance could emerge.
So I was wondering, I mean, you have this American tradition which is now anywhere from pragmatism to let's call it post-structuralist, anthropology, all kinds of things. And then you have the critical tradition, and there are at least two, perhaps three, but at the outset, two major references. It's Kantian philosophy and then Marx, which is a combination that some people might find a bit surprising. Why Kant and Marx?
Yeah, that's a good question. So
Marx with the Grundrisse, if we begin there.
Exactly, yeah. So I think Kant and Marx is the most obvious, almost, connection for me. But
well, not to anyone.
No.
I don't think I Kant and Marx.
But they should read Lucien Goldman's book on Kant. But to begin with the Grundrisse, so I sort of what I wanted to do was to try to find a way of not just applying a concept of performance onto specific art practices within a specific historical moment of art. Instead, I wanted to construct, I wanted to see, so how do we actually link categories in philosophy and in art to empirical practices? So I actually took my cue from the classical Peter Berger, who in his theory of the avant-garde starts to speak about how does Adorno actually create the aesthetic categories, or how are the aesthetic categories produced in his work. And then he goes to the Grundrisse and to these like notebooks by Marx that weren't published until the 40s, where Marx at the very beginning of the Grundrisse lays out his whole method for critiquing political economy. So that's the kind of like how to critique a field. You have to first think about how knowledge. It's a kind of like epistemological claim, almost like that I'm trying to do there with the Grundrisse in the beginning, and saying from the beginning we need to understand if we're going to critique performance, we need to first ask ourselves how we link certain dance and performance practices with certain categories. So that's the thing that I found in that part of Marx, and then the relation between Kant and Marx. I guess for me those two thinkers are very connected because they both deal with modernity. The very conditions of modernity, although Kant is of course much earlier, but that I think what I take from both of them in this particular book is the how they rethink epistemology actually. Like, so for Kant it's like the limits of what we can think and so forth, and the limits of what we can experience in aesthetics experiences and so forth. And for Marx, when he critiqued capitalism, it was very much about actually inventing, like to say that this is not natural. We need to create a critical distance to what this is, and that's why he still is, like, I think one of the only, like, he invented capitalism because he created this distance to say that there is something called capitalism. So I guess they both have an understanding of critique that is important for me in my work. But then also Marx comes back also because Marx, of course, is, I would say, vital to understand art in a contemporary condition, because art is inseparable from ideas of commodity and so forth.
What I thought, I mean, let me try this idea. I mean, Marx in the Grundrisse says that, you know, in order to understand the separate elements of capitalism, you have to look at the final product. You have to look at the fully developed structure. He says, you know, it is the anatomy of the human being that holds the key to the anatomy of the monkey. Because it's only when you have the fully developed system you can look back and say how the different parts came together. And similarly, you can say that, I guess this is your argument, that it's only when we have like the generic concept of art or something that you can actually look back and see how the various parts. We no longer think of art as distinct practices that are, you know, as it were, medium-specific or anything, but a generic concept of art. So in that sense, you would have the aesthetic autonomy, as it were, somehow perfected or brought to its logical conclusion in the same way as capitalism in the moment of its highest abstraction would be. So it seemed to me that you were almost subscribing to Peter Bürger's gesture when he places the neo-avant-garde as a kind of repetition that empties out the radicality of the historical avant-garde, because when the system is somehow complete, it's like saturated, and all these subversive elements are, as it were, absorbed into the system. But you don't seem to play that role.
No, I mean, I think I really use Peter Bürger for a very simple reason. I don't read even the whole book. I just really read the first chapter, where he really tries to understand how Adorno links his aesthetic categories, like art, for example, or like nominalism, or and try to understand the relationship between these categories in relation to the empirical reality, or to history, to the art practices themselves. So it's like a very methodological point, and I guess for me it also opened up a kind of like bridge between my interest in Marx, from the early Marx to, let's say, mature Marx of Capital, precisely because Marx is like a constant reference from chapter 1 of early Marx, but then also working in relation to the concept of practice, but also later on in relation to art as and its placeholder in capitalism, in modernity. So no, I think towards the end of the book I dismiss Peter Bürger's idea of the neo-avant-garde as much as I dismiss also Adorno said weird things, or had this conservative view on some art at the end of the 60s.
Sure. So, and again, okay, Peter Bürger, and we have Marx, the Grundriss on the one hand, which is like the theory that you have to see the system fully develop before you understand the place of the elements. You have the idea of art as developing in the same way, which gives place to, those kind of practices you investigate in it, the developed generic concept of art. So that would be the as it were, the full explication of aesthetic autonomy, with all these contradictions from Kant and onwards. But you're also, at the outset, you're citing one of the great Kantians today, Thierry de Dieu, Kant after Deschamps. You say you follow him to some extent, but not really, because he somehow dehistoricizes the concept, and he's not attentive to, he thinks of aesthetic judgment, basically. He's not attentive to the historical specificities. I think he would disagree, but then again, but you have a point, he's a Kantian, absolutely. So you need to historicize that kind of moment. But then I would say there is another key player in between Kant and Marx, that would be Hegel. And he appears in your book, but not only in that respect. How come? Why did Hegel disappear from the?
Yeah, that's a good point. A good question. I think maybe because it would be the book already has a lot on Kant, Marx, Adorno, Deleuze, a little bit. I could have squeezed in Hegel, but I think it was actually one of those.
He's there, but you're not.
He's there, exactly, and I think at least what your question points at is the importance for me, even though someone like the Dove wouldn't agree, is the aim with the book is really to. I find it difficult to use the word historicize, but to somehow place the category of performance in history, because that's to me what hasn't been done with this cultural concept of performance that I'm trying to critique.
Sure. So, but it's clear opening. We have the cultural concept of performance, which is very American to some extent, and then we have this kind of German tradition from Kant, I would say, through Hegel and Marx to Adorno, which thinks of modernity as a set of conflicts that are developing historically. So it's a fairly obvious thing. The problem is how to situate these practices in the 60s and onwards in that story, as it were. But you say that now you call them task dance and the event score, which we come back to that, but they pose specific epistemological problems, you say. What are these problems?
So in my research, what I found was that if there are certain forms in history that have been really important, like the montage, the ready-made, in the late 50s, early 60s, before the category of before there is something that we know called performance art, before all of that, there are two forms of what we today would call performance. And they are task dance and the event score.
And maybe you should explain
event
score is people know.
Yeah, event score, fluxes, you have a text and you make an event. Task dance is a term that also has some conflicts within the field. So most people in dance history would call it postmodern dance, which I disagree with. So task dance on a practical level is you have a set of instructions. So it could be very clear instructions, or it could be more like in Yvonne Rainer's case, you could have full sort of almost like maps with, for one of her performances, you have, digits and when to do what in what time, or you could have like Simone Forti, who make almost like poems. But what you have in both, for example, Yoko Ono's event scores or classical fluxus artists, and in task dance coming from Judson Church and so on, but also in California with Anna Halprin and so on, is that you have a task, you have a text, and then you have a work. And sometimes they are kind of identical, but very rarely. So there are two things on their own that make up the work. And to me, this is kind of like, John Cage is the whole like person before this, of course, together with, I would also add Merce Cunningham. But what you have is like, for the first time in the history of art, you detach ideas of material, form. This is to me where the cut with medium specificity actually begins somehow, which then paves the way for contemporary art, where there's not necessarily like a hermeneutic totality between what you see and sort of the instruction for what you see. So, but of course, totally Cajun in that sense.
Yeah. I think I was thinking about this when I read it. Perhaps the difference would be in task dance you would still rely on the piece being performed a certain way. There needs to be dancers or actors or players, whatever you would call them, would actually be performers who would do it. Whereas the event score could be exhibited as such.
Yeah.
Normally as a piece of art.
Yeah.
You can go home and do it yourself.
Yeah.
But Yvonne Rainer would never say, go home and do this yourself.
No, exactly. Yeah. So this is, I think this is true. I think what I wanted to do by maybe a bit systematically, and maybe also now when you're pointing out that difference, I think it's also a bit, roughly I do that. Yeah. But I try to put them next to one another also because I want to show how these kind of dance practices are not something on the side of what then becomes a generic concept of art, or on the side of, but they're actually in the middle of what then becomes contemporary art. So this is also a little bit like systematic of placing task dance next to the event score, because the event score is famous for that, but task dance is not somehow.
And that's part of I think that's your main argument in the second chapter, that one needs to include those things in the history of art. Normally you think about painting, conceptual art, these things you would never have. But I remember, the classical anthology of minimal art by Gregory Babcock, 16. You have the text by Yvonne Rainer there, which is the only case really.
Exactly.
It sits there as a kind of lonely bird in this long tradition of painting stuff. Yeah. So it's in the following chapter you come back to this polemic against Dewey and a certain idea of experience, and I think it's. You already said it, but I think it bears repeating. What's the problem with this idea of art as experience and intensifications and emotions and all these things? You have a long polemic. I think it deserves, because I know that a lot of people today, Richard Schusterman and others, Soma aesthetics is coming back over and over again. I have huge problems with it, and I think you have too. So I'd like you can explain why you dislike it.
Well, and maybe this is also. For maybe obvious reasons, dance and performance has created tons and tons of literature and philosophical literature and art theoretical and dance theoretical literature on the body, on the somatics, on the affections, on the emotions. And and the strong influence that John Dewey has had on this kind of literature. If you look up any sort of book on Ivan Reiner, John Dewey and his idea of experience as the breaking down between subject and object, the breaking down of the Enlightenment subject, of the Kantian subject, of the Cartesian subject, it's all there. So my problem again with that kind of someone like Dewey doesn't have a concept of art. I would argue in a modern he has of course his concept of art that's kind of based on an antique idea of from the Greeks where everything is experience or kind of ritual or but if my point was to think of these dance and performance practices in art and I guess partly coming also from a dance. I mean, I have some. The body has taken too much place. I think I want to look at these practices as art, and somehow I guess I subscribe to a certain idea of a Kantian, Adornian idea that you are able to like experience the art, not being completely immersed in it. So how can we speak about dance and performance without going straight to the flesh? You know, there is, like many philosophers have taught us, there is mediation. There is something called mediation.
So, I mean, obviously there is in the notion of experience, you know, Dewey's book, Art as Experience. And just parenthetically, I know this thing about the Greeks, you know, experiencing tragedy. There's a passage in Heidegger where he says about tragedies that no Greek ever had an experience because it was about truth, not experience. That's another thing. No, but I mean, a tradition that would seem to be aligned with this, and some people have done it, is of course, phenomenology, which has to do with Leibniz, Fabra, experience, all these terms. And you have, I think, a surprising reading of Ivan Reiner's Three Way, where you bring in phenomenology, but in a different way. Can you explain how you understand how do you use phenomenology in that analysis?
Yeah, it's. I think I didn't even think about it really, but I began exactly. I wanted to speak about the body as an object. Or to speak about the place that Reiner has in the history of minimalism, for example, where I speak about how dance has created this kind of like objection of the body and of movements, of choreographed movements, as I did, I began to look into the history of the genealogy of the concept of the object. And of course, Kant became the main reference with object. But then also, as I did that, I stumbled upon Husserl, who also has an idea of
objectivities.
Objectivities, thanks.
It's a horrible translation of Gegenstand.
Exact, Gegenstand, thank you. Lost for a second. Yeah, exactly, of the Gegenstand, of this distance to the body. And then somehow these two things, because on the one hand I wanted to speak about Ivan Reiner's work in the sense of like an aesthetic experience and as an object of art, and how the body becomes an object in her work, and the movements become an object in her work. But then also Husserl's idea of Gegenstand also worked in this equation somehow. And what I thought was maybe interesting was how often when phenomenology is brought into dance practices and performance practices, it's almost always Merleau-Ponty, or it's these concepts that you mentioned. And somehow I found another way, because I of course the book is a little bit of like it's a step away from phenomenology, because that's where most philosophical ideas about dance and performance has taken place. But somehow it's sneaked in almost from the back as I was just working somehow.
It was surprising. I was when I read it. I'm not going to quote you here, but you say something like, well, objects and movements are somehow separated from the totality, become Objektivities, Gegenständlichkeiten, and then they are, as it were, separated from everyday life, and they become objects, ideal objects in their own sense. I mean, if one looks at Merleau-Ponty, the way it's normally used, it's about the sense of presence in the world, and that's a kind of unification of partial objects into a totality. Whereas you use it in order to account for the fragmentation of movement. Here's this thing happening there, that thing happening there, and they can be serialized and placed in different relations without referring back to a unity that's given the first time. Which is, I don't know if Husserl would agree with that, but it's a surprising way to use, and it's very interesting because it really goes against the long, almost cliche tradition of understanding phenomenology.
I
think that was.
I think you put it. Yeah, thanks for the summary. I think.
I'm not sure if I got it, but
no, you absolutely got it. I think. What you're saying about what's so present in these task dance practices is that you have the object of the task, then you sort of impose them on the body through movements, which makes the work start. What I'm trying to say in this chapter really is that the works are about objectification, and this is somehow would be what I would like an extended argument would be that actually contemporary art is about how do we objectify the world, how do we come to see the world somehow, and that these kinds of task dance practices are very much about how to create something in front of us.
And that kind of objectification, or as I put it, parcelization or something, is also connected to the idea of abstraction, perhaps. Because in chapter 4 you discuss, and we come back to Marx, but also to Adorno again, and the whole thing about abstraction. I mean, what is abstraction? I mean, if you look at the visual arts, it's a long history, but you think of abstraction in a different way.
Yeah. So abstraction, I try to understand abstraction in two ways. One of them is to think about how, and here I follow Marx again, especially Marx's idea of abstract labor, which to him is the social form, and I follow this up with more contemporary thinkers like Moïse Postone and so on, who argues that contemporary current capitalism is structured by the social form of abstract labor. Okay, what does this mean? It means we are separated from the commodities, from the objects, from ourselves. I mean, the classical Marx in a way, but that it's now a social form that structures everything. So separation, abstraction is somehow part of the social form of capitalism. But then you have an idea of, then I guess what I do with Adorno is Adorno's idea of as you know, Adorno's idea of aesthetics and art is that it's a fait social. It's connected to society, but only by being abstracted from it. So it's like a separation. Again, we have abstraction. It's a separation, and it is the separation that makes it into art, right? So I wanted to bring those two things together by saying capitalism is structured by something called abstract labor, if we follow these thinkers like Moïse Postone after Marx and so on. But then art is also about abstraction. And then again, I wanted to place these two major things in relation to these performance practices and think about how they also actually work with abstraction, the abstracting of movements, the abstracting of the body.
Yeah, but obviously this, to me, two senses are mapped onto each other.
Yeah.
So I want to come back to the final reading, which I think is the most interesting reading. I mean, there's a lot of stuff here about of a specific work where you discuss also using structuralism and Deleuze and Etienne Balibar and others to discuss Trisha Brown's piece of this accumulation series, which is a series of pieces in various versions. And many of these works exist in many versions for solo dancer and several people. But you really study this parcelization and fragmentation and serialization, repetition of movement, and you really show well, I think, how this abstraction works in the sense of being reflected, treated, mimetically absorbed, but also reworked in the actual work itself. So can you say something about how you read this piece by Trisha Brown?
So this this piece by Trisha Brown is also one of the pieces that came to me most at the very in the last chapter. And it's also work that goes a little bit outside of the time frame, because it's a work from 1971, where in the piece she isolates movements, and very, very simple movement, or we can speak about whether they're simple or not, but they look simple. And she has a mathematical procedure for how to put them together. So in a text she wrote about the piece, she writes 1 + 2 + 3. There's a kind of like mathematical procedure. But what happens that I find interesting is that she stands there doing these movements, and she kind of like, she as a dancer, like the subject of the dance, merges with the dance somehow. So it becomes the structure and the subject of the structure, to maybe reference Balibar in the chapter that I'm using a lot, come together. And after reading this piece, what I came to realize was that all of a sudden, and then I came to the concept of structure in Deleuze, in his
how do we recognize
how do we recognize structure? And what I found was how all of a sudden the two fields of a cultural concept of performance and a critical concept of performance, all of a sudden they came together in this more nuanced reading of what Etienne Balibar calls the performativity of the Cartesian eye.
Yeah. No, I think it's a very striking thing, because normally if one looks at the philosophical debates in the 60s, phenomenology versus structuralism, system versus subject, and all these things. And Deleuze's text, in 1967, it wasn't published because I guess it's so unorthodox they couldn't publish it until the early 70s, because he really thinks that structuralism is about rethinking the subject and practice.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is not what one normally would assume. And so in that sense, it really shifts the parameters of. And it shows to some extent, I think it shows in a very somehow beautiful way how you can think, how the artwork reflects on, introjects, but also works on the structures, on these abstract structures. I think you write something that it is as if these movements came to the dancer from without, but she picks them up and then shoots them forward and somehow transforms them. So it's a very intriguing reading. Ja, vad fint.
Ja, jag kände att det var på väg, så jag bara såhär, nej nu ska jag